Thank you so much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper, which I very much enjoyed reading. And I had the easiest task in motivating its importance, given the high inflation environment that we're experiencing and the link that I think it's pretty clear between that and the electoral fates of politicians. And this paper takes up this issue and addresses several important related questions. One is, how do independent central banks influence the electoral chances of politicians? What type of central bankers would political incumbents prefer to appoint? And what does that mean for welfare and economic outcomes? And to do this, it proposes a novel channel for how central bank actions influence electoral outcomes. And that channel goes through the cost of uncertainty associated with political transitions. So to give you the biggest picture of the motivation here, the classical literature that focused on central bank independence has focused on motivating why we need independence, given the danger of political business cycles. And it has shown that we can get political business cycles even if voters are fully rational and understand these incentives of politicians, as long as there's some informational asymmetry between voters and politicians. As long as voters don't learn everything about the state of the world, there's a chance for politicians to benefit from the political business cycle. And this also has spilled over into recent literature on delegating to bureaucratic agencies more broadly. What this paper does is to take as given the results of this old literature that central banks should be independent, and assumes they are independent, but to look at what that independent action of a central bank means for the political process, and particularly for the electoral chances of politicians. And to propose this novel mechanism for the effect of monetary policy on the political process, which is through this expectation of distortions coming from central bank action after a political transition. That will change the benefit of actually engaging in a political transition to begin with. Now, Caroline has already discussed the model setup, so I will skip over it in the interest of time and just summarize the key insight here, or the key mechanism, which is that after the first period of the game, voters learn the type of politician that they're dealing with, the incumbents type. And they're faced with an election in which they can re-elect the incumbent, in which case the world tomorrow will be the same as the world today. Or they can draw a new politician, a challenger, whose type is going to be drawn from a known distribution, but will not be known to the voter until after the election. And so how does the central bank action matter here? Well, if you re-elect the incumbent that you know, nothing changes in the world, so there's no deviation from inflation expectations that the central bank can engage in. And so it cannot manipulate unemployment and inflation. So you're stuck with the inflation that you expect and the unemployment that is given by the quality of the incumbent that you already know as a voter. However, if you elect a challenger, well, then this type is realized after the election. So there's space there for the central bank to act, to adjust inflation and unemployment according to its objective. And if the central bank has a more inflationary averse, is going to adjust more in the direction of lower inflation than the voter would want. So what it means is that when you're electing a challenger, even if that challenger is really good at decreasing unemployment, the action of the central bank is going to mute that decrease in unemployment, because the central bank will adjust unemployment and inflation, and it will decrease inflation at the cost of some unemployment. And therefore, this just reduces the expected benefit of electing a challenger in the first place. And as a consequence, if you're an incumbent, well, then you prefer this inflation adverse central bank because it's going to make the expected benefit of someone else being elected lower. And that's kind of the key mechanism here. So now my comments on this. first, it's a novel and interesting mechanism. And what it got me thinking first is how do I square this mechanism with the kind of previous view or the older models in which the story was all about informational asymmetries within the current period. So essentially voters learning something about the incumbent and the action of the central bank affecting that learning in favor of the incumbent. You can still get an inflation-averse central bank being preferred by an incumbent in a situation with informational asymmetries if, for example, that action of the central bank keeps the bad incumbent from doing some really bad policy. It keeps them from engaging in a particular type of destructive fiscal policy. In that case, maybe it actually keeps the voters from learning someone's really incompetent. And so what I was thinking of is how do these different mechanisms square? Can we disentangle them? Are predictions different from the two of them that we can then look up in practice or in the data? And perhaps related to this, the appointing a hawk or a dove at the helm of the central bank could come from both motivations, from both mechanisms. It can be this uncertainty cost that the paper is showing, or it could be just this informational asymmetry that would get a politician to signal that they're competent by appointing a particular type of person. So thinking about how we disentangle this is my first issue. The second one on the political economy side is that the model is kind of showing us this benchmark case where we have essentially a median voter who wants to minimize the social welfare loss. In practice, we have political factions, we have conflict over these policy objectives, and we might have two different politicians who serve different factions of voters who benefit differently from inflation reduction versus unemployment reduction. And so what does this imply for potential fluctuations in the type of central bank mandate that we see or the type of person that's elected or nominated to lead the central bank? Similarly, my third comment, and you might notice here a pattern of just going outside the model, because I think it really opens up a lot of related questions. The third point is about this feedback loop. The fact that in this model, the central bank is not a strategic player. The central bank just does its thing. But in reality, you can think about this mandate of the central bank, and especially if it has objectives independence, its choice of objective as a response to its own expectations about government fiscal policy competence. And in that case, we end up with this feedback loop where what we see the central bank doing in terms of inflation aversion is driven by what it expects the government to do. And then finally, on the empirical side, Caroline didn't have time to present the full empirical exercise, but it shows that disaggregating the measure of central bank independence along the dimensions of appointment of the central banker versus independence of objectives versus other measures of independence gives a positive correlation between appointment ability and re-election chances of incumbents, and also between objective independence and re-election chances of incumbents. There are several issues that this led me to think about. The main one is, what do we know about uncertainty or the uncertainty channel in this empirical exercise? And is there a way to go and show some evidence about whether voters don't know about the challenger? What happens in these elections in which a challenger who is competing against an incumbent has been in government before, and therefore there's variations in just how little the voters know about the challenger? And also related to particular this data that they're looking at, how should we think about the uncertainty generated by a political successor that follows a politician who is term limited, and that therefore counts as being an incumbent that's re-elected, but that is just a different person that comes into office and therefore generates uncertainty? Is there a way to exploit these differences in potential uncertainty to kind of get at this mechanism and compare it again to the other mechanism of just informational asymmetries? And then, of course, getting to the end of the paper, I was just wondering what are the policy implications that we should take from it? how should central bank appointments be structured? Should we give more flexibility to political leaders in making these appointments? And what are the implications now for the discussions currently about broadening the mandates of central banks? Will this electoral channel kind of amplify the distortions if we allow the central bank to even have more tools at its disposal on the regulatory side? So that's all. It's a very nice paper. It pushes this research agenda on the political economy of central banking and provides a novel mechanism for thinking about how central bank independence feeds into the political process. And as my comments showed, it opens up several avenues for exploring this connection further and learning more about the relationship between central bank objectives and political incentives. Thank you.